Okay, my name is Gary Kinsman. I teach in the sociology department at Laurentian University. I'm a longtime anti-capitalist and queer liberation activist, and I guess currently, if I'm describing my work, I'm the co-author of a new book called The Canadian War on Queers, National Security as Sexual Regulation. I mean, I think there's pockets of really good things going on. There's, the development of new forms of working class organizing in some areas. There's also this workers' assembly that's been formed in Toronto. So I think there's some positive signs, but I think in general what you've seen is a retreat on the part of the labor movement, a sort of retrenchment, trying to defend what they already have, less of a concern for sort of social unionism and aligning with other struggles that are going on in our society. Now that is sort of my general impression. I do come from Sudbury, so I'm also living in the city where there's been a strike by the largest local of the union movement in town, Local 6500 of the steelworkers, since last July. And I have to say that what you see there, in my opinion, is a strike that the stakes are huge in this strike. I mean, basically Valley Inco is trying to take away a lot of the hard-won gains of the workers in Sudbury. And the way in which the steelworkers have organized and the past practices of that local, which is almost along sort of hierarchical business union lines, have really not prepared them for the type of struggle they need. Now there's been some attempts to turn that around. There's been demonstrations of 2,000 workers in January, 5,000 workers last month, and more recently there was actually a blockade that was established from last Friday morning until Wednesday when the union leadership called it down. So there's indications that things can actually change. Whether that's significant enough to turn it around, and I think in some ways maybe that's a sort of microcosm of what's going on in the labor movement across North America anyway, which is workers are being attacked. Some of them are trying to fight back, but oftentimes their leaderships are not really able to facilitate that fight back. And I think unfortunately we still have a lot of union leaders who are more scared of at least a section of their membership, sort of the more militant rank and file, than they are of the corporation that they're up against, and will actually think that those rank and file workers are their biggest danger and biggest problem, rather than the group of people that actually needs to be empowered and facilitated in terms of their organizing efforts. More globally speaking, if I could just mention that for a second, I think it's also important for us to recognize, I think there's a way, and this is especially important given we're at a historical materialism conference, in which we sort of see the economic crisis as sort of being outside our struggles and outside our lives. One of the interesting things is I actually think we need to see ourselves in some ways as causing or being the crisis of capitalism, to give ourselves more agency, more subjectivity in this context. So for instance, if you look at what's going on in Greece right now, I mean, Greece is clearly in turmoil, lots of popular uprisings against the imposition of austerity measures on them. But why is, in some ways, Greece sort of like a center point of the capitalist crisis right now? Part of it is that they've had incompetent neoliberal governments, but the major part of it is that working class and popular movements have actually maintained a level of organizing that have prevented neoliberalism from sort of fully reestablishing its profitability. So in a certain sense you can see in the Greek example how we actually are the crisis of capitalism, and we need to actually begin to see ourselves that way. And I think unfortunately the union movement's response by and large to the current capitalist crisis, and I don't just think it's an economic crisis, I think there's a multi-layered crisis of the financial crisis, a recession, the global food crisis, the climate change crisis. All of these things now intersect in terms of producing a sort of more generalized crisis of capitalism. And we need to see the possibilities that are also here, not just to sort of say, oh, there's a recession, we need to retrench, we need to pull back, we need to just defend what we're doing. And I think the labor movement also needs to see that it's at this particular moment when they need to be reaching out to all of the other groups of people who are struggling in our society, whether it's people of color struggling against the so-called war on terror, whether it's people living in poverty. I mean, there needs to be real alliances built. I think part of it is that finance capital is so mystified for people. Once people start talking about that a lot of people don't have the capacity to sort of grasp it, and I think that's actually a problem on the part of the left. We haven't been able to produce a sort of popular analysis that allows people to understand what's going on. But I mean, it is obviously a crisis of finance capitalism. But if you look at this a little bit, what you see is that one of the strategies that neoliberalism adopted in relationship to working class and popular struggles was in opposition to what Keynesianism had said, which is like, let's give the workers and the poor people a little bit more money so they can actually purchase some more commodities, so the crises of capitalism will at least be a little bit more attenuated. What they said was, well, let's give them credit, right? Let's give them credit. Let's let them buy things they can't actually afford. And in some ways that postpones the crisis, but it doesn't get rid of it. I mean, and what we've actually seen, I think, in some ways, that intersecting with a whole series of other dynamics of crisis has actually produced the current context that we find ourselves in. And in a certain sense, the only way capitalism is going to get out of this crisis is, once again, are they going to be successful in being able to resolve it at the expense of workers and poor people in societies around the world? And it is a global capitalist crisis. And I think that's still a little bit up in the air. Certainly the level of resistance and response within the global north, except perhaps in such places as Greece and maybe some of the other southern European countries, hasn't been adequate to rejecting sort of like the capitalist solution to the crisis. But it's still up in the air. It's still something we can act and intervene in. It's not like sort of the economy just rolls over us. I mean, economies, I actually find the expression the economy itself a form of reification, because what we're really talking about is social relationships between people, not some sort of thing that you could call the economy. And that's again a problem with how the left takes up these discussions, right? And if you talk about the economy as sort of like this object over there that somehow controls and dominates our lives, it doesn't give us much sense of how we could actually intervene to try to transform the situations we find ourselves in. I mean, certainly, it partly depends on how you define and how you describe capitalism and also class. I use very open-ended, broad-ranging notions of what capitalism is, which includes, as part of the working class, people engaging in unpaid labor, right? And also, all of the various forms of oppression in terms of racialization, in terms of sexism, in terms of heterosexism, all of the different forms of marginalization and oppression, for me, are part of that broader notion of what capitalism is. Now, if you see capitalism in that broader sense, it is seductive, and I think it's seductive particularly in the way in which sort of commodity fetishism has run wild, processes of reification have run wild, where what's actually produced by people, social relationships between people, get converted into things and objects that we then come to worship in consumer capitalist types of society. So, there certainly is that seductive aspect, the construction of desires for these things and commodities and objects that we don't really need. And that's something we really have to challenge and take apart. But I think, again, what I want to remind people of is how, like that new value, all of those commodities, all of those things, all of those objects are produced by workers, whether they're paid or unpaid, and they're appropriated from us, right? And in a certain sense, if we saw that we'd actually produced this world, right? Even if it's horrifying in some major ways because of the appropriation of what we've produced from us and how those things that we've produced actually come to stand over and against us in our everyday lives. If we had a notion that we actually produce those, we've lost control over them, what we need to do is sort of democratically and collectively regain control over them and then figure out how to do it very differently so that we actually will never lose control over what we're producing again, and so we can actually talk about how we could build a new social world, like a new society, a better world, in which we're actually able to exist in harmony or with a great deal of respect for the ecological worlds around us, that we're part of those ecological worlds, we're part of those ecological networks, and we depend upon them, and that every single form of oppression, exploitation, and marginalization is something that we have to put at the center of our social attention. That for me means that we could actually be much more optimistic about how the capitalist crisis, even the seductiveness of capitalism, could actually be contested. Right? All of these terrains could become battlefields where we actually try to reestablish our ability to intervene and to redefine those situations. And I think for me what's really important is to understand that we need to operate within capitalism, against it. Right? We obviously have to operate within it because we are part of it, but there's no real place outside it now that we could start to resist from. There still are in some places around the world, and maybe to some extent For some indigenous communities, even in North America, there's some places to start outside. But most of us are inside it. So we need to start within it, but we also need to struggle against it. And I think one of the most important things is within those struggles against it, we need to begin to engage in constructing new ways of doing things that give us a sense of what's beyond, what are alternatives to capitalist society. So I draw that sort of notion from John Holloway's work, that we need to operate simultaneously, and this is difficult, but I think really important, within, against, and beyond the limitations of capitalism and oppression. Well, if it's someone who I presume from your description would probably at least be heterosexual identified and have no real knowledge about queer liberation struggles, I mean, I would first of all just talk about sexuality. Like, is sexuality important in your life? You know, is that something that you can see as being like an important part of who you are? Can you see how, if that was something that was sort of denied and oppressed and silenced, that might be a problem for you? So I would first of all try to get them to sort of place themselves. I mean, this is what I do with my students too. I often use a quote from Charlotte Bunch where she said, you know, if you want to understand what heterosexual privilege is all about, try going about your life for a week as a queer, right? I can't actually ask my students to do that, but I can at least ask them to think about it, right? To put yourself in that place. And then you have a sense of what heterosexual privilege is all about. What would that mean for your friends? What would that mean for your family? What would that mean for you at your workplace? All of these things can give you a sense of what the substance and fabric of heterosexual social privilege is all about. And then to also get them to recognize that, you know, the struggles that queer people have engaged in have actually been significant ones, right? I mean, we've won a lot of gains and victories. There's a lot of problems with how the mainstream gay movement is now organized, but I think people have a certain type of recognition that there's some real power and capacity there that people on the more general left need to be engaging with. But also that we have real lessons, real acquisitions that we can bring forward to people who haven't had the same experiences, right? Experiences of different ways of organizing eroticism, different ways of organizing relationships. In terms of like the institutionalization of masculinity, you know, there are things about relationships between two men, for instance, in terms of how you negotiate, even like who's going to clean the toilet or whatever, right? That actually bring into view for us, I think, really important resources and insights for those people who still might want to define themselves as heterosexual, but who don't want to live within the current form of institutionalized heterosexuality. I think one of the biggest problems with how sort of the mainstream gay movement has gone is that by constructing ourselves as simply a minority that doesn't really have anything to say to other people, all we want is to sort of be left alone in our ghettos or in our communities and to have our pride marches once a year, and that's all we really want. By constructing ourselves as a minority, rather than seeing that our experiences actually are important for everyone, right? We've cut off the ways in which some of our experiences could actually be useful for those people who might identify themselves as heterosexual or at least being interested in different gender eroticism, who actually want to live outside institutionalized heterosexuality. So those sort of connections have been broken by that sort of the more respectable, responsible performance of being gay in our society. And it seems to me that if we can open up those lines of communication, what we'll find is there's a lot of people who identify as heterosexual who are not really happy with what's going on, who want to live things differently. They don't necessarily want to become queer, but maybe they want to engage in the practice of queering what heterosexuality is. And that would be a really important basis for coming together. Well, it is a big book, but I guess the central project is to provide the first pretty comprehensive historical sociological investigation of the social organization of the national security campaigns in Canada against lesbians and gay men that started in the 50s and go on to the 1990s and in some ways are still ongoing in our society. In terms of how it does that, it tries to develop certain types of notions of history from below, developed by E.P. Thompson, but extending them to deal with the experiences of queer people. So we start with the stories, the narratives of people who were directly affected by the national security campaigns, people who were purged, people who were forced to inform on their friends, people who were put under surveillance. Those are the stories we start with, and we construct a standpoint within those people's experiences, within the experiences of queer people, constructing a sort of standpoint of queer people as a site from which to then critically interrogate the sort of ruling texts and the forms of social organization of the national security regime. Now, there's a couple of things that are really important about the book that I think are important for people to know about. you might think this is sort of a sad story of how lesbians and gay men and queer people more generally were repressed by the national security regime. And in part it is that story. But more importantly for us, it's actually a story of how people were able to actively resist those national security campaigns, even before the existence of any gay or lesbian social movements, and concretely obstruct the practices of the RCMP. And of course, once there were lesbian and gay liberation movements in the 1970s, people were able to act in ways that pretty significantly undermined the social organization of the national security campaign. So that's a really important story, a story of resistance, agency, the possibilities of transformation, and sort of inspiration, we hope, for activists today. We talk a lot in the book about what we describe as the social organization of forgetting, that ruling often takes place in our society through the erasure of historical memory, historical literacy. So we don't remember the struggles that people have been engaged in the past, that won us the social spaces or the social programs that we often take for granted in our lives today. I mean, if we knew the sort of pain and suffering that people had gone through, for instance, to win some of the social programs, let's just say social assistance, if we actually could feel that in our bodies, if we could historically remember that in an embodied way, we would be in a much stronger position to resist what they're trying to do now with massive cuts to social assistance, for instance. And I think it operates somewhat similarly in relationship to queer experiences as well. So the alternative, or the antidote, if you want, to the social organization of forgetting is what we refer to as the resistance of remembering. Remembering those struggles, those capacities for agency and transformation that people have engaged in the past. So that's another important message in the book. And I guess I'll just mention one other one, which is we talk about national security as an ideological practice. It's a particularly useful sort of conceptualization for the relations of ruling in our society to have this notion of national security, because in a certain sense, who's going to not identify with the nation they're supposed to be part of? Who's going to not identify with the security of that supposed nation? And what we point out is that we always need to ask, whose national security are we talking about? Because national security always operates to exclude or to expel from the fabric of the nation a whole bunch of people, and to include some other people at the center of the nation. So during the Canadian War on Queers, well, queer people were expelled from the fabric of the nation. Heterosexuality was, in contrast, and in a certain relational sense, constructed as being the normal, natural, safe, secure sexuality. So the national security campaigns played a very clear part in constructing heterosexual hegemony in the Canadian context and constructing forms of sexual regulation. Now, if we jump forward to the current context of the so-called war on terror, what we see is that national security is still being deployed as an ideological practice. This time, the targets are somewhat different. They include lots of queer people of color, but it's basically based on the expulsion of Muslim and Arab-identified people, and sometimes other people of color, from the fabric of the nation state, and the construction of sort of a white, Christian-derived culture as being sort of the taken-for-granted, normal Canadian culture at the center of society. So we need to be really highly critical of national security as an ideological practice. And that's really important. I mean, some people have tried to interpret the Canadian War on Queers, or what you might want to talk about as the national security campaigns against lesbians and gay men, as simply the mistake of some homophobic individuals. And it's really important to remind people that from our historical examination, queer people were actually constructed textually and in reality as a national security threat through this period of time. And it's important to understand that that wasn't simply some sort of mistake. It's important for people to remember that right now when some people within lesbian and gay communities are being deployed in support of national security, because in a very ironic way, even though moral conservatives never sort of push forward the need for lesbian and gay liberation in the United States or Canada, they're concerned about it in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine, right? So this means we need to raise some critical questions about how they're actually deploying very limited notions of women's rights and lesbian and gay rights in a very orientalist way to try to construct people in the Arab and Islamic world as supposedly being backward and anti-modern and homophobic. And it's really important for us to challenge that way in which they're trying to use certain types of rhetorics around women's rights and around lesbian and gay rights. One of the reasons why I think in the context of current queer organizing, especially in Toronto, that the group that's most under attack is Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, is precisely because it's a current within queer activism that is resisting that deployment of lesbian and gay rights as a weapon against people struggling in the Middle East and in Palestine in particular. So it's one of the reasons why it's quite likely that the Pride Committee in Toronto might actually decide officially to exclude Queers Against Israeli Apartheid from the march this year, which is going to be incredibly unfortunate, a real travesty of the whole history of Pride Day, a real denial of how queer people played an important part in the struggle against South African apartheid, for instance. But also, it's an attempt to sort of, again, participate in the social organization of forgetting where queer liberation movements have come from. The queer liberation movements, when they originated in the late 60s and early 70s, even if they were critical of parts of the left and parts of the sort of other social movements that they found around themselves, were part of a broader sort of left composition of struggle. So it's really important for us to think about where we've come from and how we actually had linkages with the left in a broad sense, and also the struggles of other social movements at that point in time. Yes, I can say a few words about it. I mean, it's very peculiar because there's two sort of ways in which sort of Arabic and Islamic culture gets constructed in sort of the context of the war on terror. One is still sort of the older notion that somehow the Arab and Islamic world is sort of decadent, right? And that decadence in some ways includes lots of same-gender eroticism. Because I mean, if you actually know anything about Arab and Islamic cultures, even though it would not be named as homosexuality or queerness or anything like that, there's actually a lot of sort of indigenous practices of same-gender eroticism. So there's that earlier moment whereby Arab and Islamic cultures were sort of constructed as being decadent, in part identified as being queer. On the other hand, the other way in which it's deployed in the context of the war on terror, I mean, that first one's orientalist, the second one also is. The other way in which it's deployed is to construct Arab and Islamic cultures as being, anti-modern, backward, or even barbaric, because they don't support women's rights and lesbian and gay rights. I mean, I think you saw this also in terms of a lot of the controversies that were generated around the torture, which was, physical torture, and sexualized torture at Abu Ghraib, whereby you sort of saw this construction of sort of like the mock homosexual positions, pseudo-homosexual positions that people were placed in, were somehow the most horrifying part of the torture, rather than the sort of more physical, directly, engaging with people's bodies in terms of torture, aspects of the torture that was going on. So you sort of see this notion constructed that one of the significant indicators of the supposed backwardness of Arab and Islamic cultures is supposedly their opposition to women's rights and their opposition to lesbian and gay rights. And it's always been, incredibly ironic to me that these moral conservatives, who never really would push the questions of lesbian and gay liberation in the North American context, are now concerned about it in countries in the Middle East. So I hope that elaborates on it a little bit. And I think we need to reject those orientalist constructions, both of those different views, right? I mean, we need to recognize that there are lots of same-gender erotic practices in Arab and Islamic cultures that can't necessarily be understood within the sort of heterosexual, homosexual binary. I mean, I guess another aspect I could put in place is that part of the development of capitalist globalization on cultural and sexual levels is an attempt to impose the heterosexual, homosexual binary on the whole planet. Right? That's part of what's currently going on with capitalist globalization. And that creates a difficult situation for queer activists in the North and the West to operate from. Because what you see is that there's indigenous same-gender erotic practices in lots of these cultures that cannot be read and cannot be understood through the heterosexual, homosexual polarity in lots of these cultures and societies that need to be defended, right? Those are important spaces and practices that need to be defended. But at the same time, because there has been progress for the imposition of this homosexual, heterosexual binary around the world, which has lots of problems, there are also going to be, in many countries in the global south, people who now identify as being lesbian, gay, or queer. So we have to navigate both the defense of those, in defense of those indigenous same-gender erotic practices, as well as obviously in support of those people who will want to describe themselves as lesbian and gay. I'll say two things. One is I'm very influenced by the Zapatistas. And one of the interesting things about the Zapatistas is they haven't simply just called forward for an international solidarity movement to support them. Clearly that's happened. But one of the most significant things they've always said to people who come from away to provide support for them, is that's important, but what we really need is for you to rebel where you are, in your own locations, right? Because your rebellions there will be the best material political assistance you can provide for us. So what I would encourage people to think about is, given where you're located, what are the most significant things that you could rebel around, that you could join together with other people? And I guess the other thing I'd want to say is I think the most effective forms of activism are ones that are informed by some of the principles of direct action. That is, actually getting our bodies involved in the struggle, defying unjust laws, getting more actively involved in the struggle. Forms of direct action, forms of direct democracy, to me, are absolutely crucial. I'm not dismissing writing letters, petitions, any of those things. Those can all be useful in all sorts of different contexts. But we can't change the world those ways. They may be useful as tactics to get more people involved and to get issues out there in the society more generally. But if we're actually talking about effective forms of activism, I think that's the most useful thing to think about, is what is effective as a form of activism? What will actually bring about change? And I'm just going to cite two examples from my own activist experience. I was involved in AIDS Action Now, which was my first experience in direct action politics. AIDS Action Now was a group based in Toronto that was trying to get access for people living with AIDS and HIV to promising drugs and treatments that they were being denied either by the government or by pharmaceutical corporations. And one of the things I know from being involved in that activism, I know, in my body, right, in a very embodied way, is that by engaging in forms of direct action, we were actually able to get some of those drugs and treatments into the bodies of people who needed them. And that, for me, is crucial. Right? I mean, it's also a message about how can we change the world. I mean, obviously, we were doing relatively small-scale transformation in those cases, but it gives us a message about how we can change the world more fundamentally. Another experience is actually having been involved in some radical direct action-based support work for people living in poverty. And I know that you could call up the bureaucrats in Sudbury and Ontario Works, and you would have someone who's approached you and needs to get their check that day, and you'll be told by the bureaucrat or the official, there's absolutely no way you're going to get that check that day, right? And we know, I mean, I learned this, if you send 10 or 15 people down to particular people's offices and clog up their operations for a day, you can actually get that check by the end of the day. Now, that doesn't change the entire world, but it makes very concrete material difference, and it shows that it's through people taking direct action, seizing more control over our lives, or opening up more space for ourselves, getting our bodies involved in our political resistance, not just talking about things, not just being polite, but actually doing things that are effective in disrupting and disorganizing ruling relations. I think that's the way to go. I mean, you obviously are also doing research at the same time as you're involved in activism. I guess that's another thing, is to always think that through. If you're going to try to determine what is the most effective form of activism, it also means that every time you're an activist, when you're out there engaging in struggle, you're also doing research. Like, what is the weak link here? What is the weakest point that we could push on? And if we push on that, could we actually make some progress here? I refer to that as mapping the social relations of struggle in a book that I edited with other people called Sociology for Changing the World.